Hello, everyone. I'm Jørgen Gåsemyr, and I've been gifted the enormous privilege of not only being invited over the mountains and back to Bergen, where I've spent many happy years living and working, but also to be at Bergen Global and with colleagues and friends at CMI, and lastly, and a little bit important for this day, to mark the occasion of the publication of a book called Chinese Development Aid and Africa, What, How, and Why. And that's what we are here to discuss today. And China is obviously the world's second largest economy and still growing. It is the key or the top economic partner overall for quite a few countries all over the world, including in Africa, and it's an increasing, expanding, growing actor also when it comes to international development aid. So I guess from this point of view, it's quite obvious why we have engaged in a project and participated in writing a book, but today we are here to present some of those findings. So we are here with Elling Tjønneland, who is the editor of the book and has been the leader of the project financed by the Research Council of Norway. And we are here with Xuefei and Lovise Aalen and Stein, Sundstøl, Eriksen, who all have a lot of achievements and merits, and we can go on about all their credentials, but the most important thing of everything they have done is, of course, contributing with a chapter to this book. So today we'll go into some of the questions and some of the findings, and hopefully that will inspire also everyone listening here in the audience and online to go back and read the book and come back with even more questions. And there will be, as always, here some time at the end to ask questions, both for participants who are online and who are here with us here physically. So starting out, Elling, you have led the project and led the very exciting, but I'm also trust a very hard process of getting the book together. So I want to give you to start a few minutes to give us a bit of the background of why we have done this and some of the questions that we started out with and some of the things we landed on.
Thank you, Hans. It started off, and I'll be quick on that, with a grant from the Research Council, and we brought together researchers from Norway, CMI, NUPI, China, Africa, to work on the project. And the reason why we wanted to focus on this is that China has been expanding its development aid program quite significantly. And Africa has been a focus for that. So that's the background. But I'll jump into what is our emerging findings in the chapters of the book. Not everything, but I'd like to make 4 points. The first is that China is both a big and a small aid donor country. Big in the sense that it has a large aid budget and also funding from other government ministries and so on into aid-related activities. And while there isn't much transparency and details provided by the Chinese authorities about where the aid money is going and so on, we know quite a lot. To simplify, the size of China's aid is more or less about the same as Norway, perhaps a little bit higher, but it's which makes China a big bilateral donor country, but far behind the main traditional or Western donor countries, but still sizable and important. But it is small in other respects. It's small measured as a percentage or a fraction of the size of its economy. And quite a number of the so-called other new donor countries, Turkey, Gulf states and so on, they are far, far ahead of China, measured as a share of their contribution from their gross national income. In that sense, China is an insignificant donor. But as you said, Hans, taking into account that it's the world's second biggest economy, whatever it does is important. And of course, the significance, the importance of China lies in all the other areas, trade, investment, and so on. The second point I want to make is that although China is important, it does not really step in when traditional donor countries cut their aid, which they have been doing for the past couple of years, and especially last year when the US aid closed down and so on, and Trump, made drastic cuts. The US is the biggest donor country. China haven't really stepped in a sense. They've been sitting still in the boat and been protecting the international multilateral order and being predictable. But they haven't provided additional money when other donor countries cut back. Third point I want to make is that the main type of Chinese aid is bilateral aid, directly from China to individual countries. And perhaps, at least when it comes to the regular aid budget, half of it might be flowing to Africa. And here we have seen both major expansion over the last 20 years, but also significant changes emerging in the last 5 to 10 years. The dominant new feature of Chinese aid has been concessional loans mainly for infrastructure development, whereby the aid budget in China is used to lower the interest rates on finance from China. Interestingly, the loans are going down quite significantly. It peaked nearly 10 years ago. Now it's much less. Partly, I think, because China also experienced that a number of the borrowers were unable to service the debt, so they become more critical in doing that. The other dominant feature of Chinese aid, in addition to the loans, is what we call the typical grant aid, which in China's case is mostly provision of support for health, agriculture, and education. And China has expanded that area quite significantly also over the last 20 years. And in this process, China has become also, in some respects, a bit similar to traditional donor countries. They've been facing the same challenges, sustainabilities, African partners wanting other things, so China has adapted. And in that process, they have struggled with the same challenges as traditional donors, and also in some respects become perhaps more similar to traditional aid. I should end just that bilateral component by saying one thing, and that is that what they've been doing has been quite significant in the loans, for example, both concessional and non-concessional loans. I mean, it's been estimated, figures are not very precise, but about 20% of all finance for infrastructure development in Africa over the past decade, from 2010 to 2020, was provided by China. And that's a significant figure. Today it's probably much lower, probably down to 4, 5, 6%. My final point is that most of China's aid is provided as bilateral aid. They're also channeling resources to multilateral channels, both through UN agencies, through development finance institutions, the World Bank and so on, but also trying to facilitate other and new institutions outside the traditional Western dominance. The interesting thing here and important finding is that China, when it comes to the traditional multilateral institutions, the UN agencies and so on, China does very little beyond paying what they have to do as a member. They pay their mandatory membership fees. And the membership fees are quite significant, because when the UN, its General Assembly, for example, makes decisions about what members should pay into the UN, that is based on the size of the economy, size of the population, with some deductions for development status and so on. And it implies that when it comes to the core funding of the UN, the so-called general budget, China 20 years ago or 25 years ago paid 1, 2, or 3% of the total membership. Now it's up to 15, similar in peace keeping and so on. But beyond that, it's very little. The significant exception, and very interesting exception, is support to the World Bank's window or facility for providing concessional loans, which China is also becoming very big. Thank you.
All right, we'll turn to some of those issues. And you have been the editor and the leader of the project, so we have to accept that you spend a few minutes giving us a good introduction. I just want to emphasize for everyone here that it's a book about and a project about international development aid and development assistance. So although we of course also discuss matters related to trade, other terms of economic engagements, commercially based loans, it's the aid component that we are mostly focused on, just to be clear on that. Now I will ask each of you also to give a very short snapshot, basically what your chapters are about, one or two of the main findings, and it would also be interesting to know if something surprised you along the way. I mean, we have been doing this for a few years, and if there were questions you had in the beginning that look a bit different at the start and what we ended up with. And none of you are editors or have been leaders of the projects. You don't get as much time as Elling's, but a couple or 3 minutes. So we can start with you, Xuefei.
Thank you. And I want to thank Elling first to give this opportunity, for extending some research, originally from my PhD, and after 10 years, I don't want to say that. So then, so my contribution to the book is that I bring in the discussion of the role of Chinese provinces. So the Chinese provinces are similar to the states in the United States. They are huge. They are the size usually of a country, and with a big GDP as well. So when we talk about China in Africa or China's general role in the world, so lots of people usually assume that it's a unitary, a centrally coordinated actor, from the capital city of Beijing. But it's actually not usually the case. China has more than 30 provincial units, and just like Africa is another country and has more than 50 different countries. So we have to look the individual provinces' activities in different African countries to get a better picture of, and not to overgeneralize the whole China in Africa thing. So all the Chinese provinces, most of the Chinese provinces, they are first of all the implementer of China's central policy. They send out medical teams to African countries and agricultural teams, and they provide scholarships. And throughout this process, they also become involved in the broader China-Africa economic interaction. So they create a venue for their own economic interest. They bring trade and the investment from their own province. So I use two provinces as case studies in the chapter. One is called Hunan. That's a landlocked province, like in central China. So before it got the opportunity in Africa, it had very limited compared to more developed coastal provinces in China. It had very limited external interactions with foreign countries. So, but using this China-African platform, so Hunan has now become a leading province in China in terms of China-African trade, and because it has sent out medical teams and agricultural teams to several African countries, and throughout this through these connections, it has become a permanent host of China-Africa economic and trade expo, and so most of the goods China imported from Africa are now sent to Hunan first, where there's also an institutionalized tax-free zone. So to sum up, so China is not a monolith actor. So it has so many different actors representing their own interests and using their resources, and that's my core argument and contribution. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Lovise?
Yes, okay. So in my chapter, I have been looking at assistance from China to develop higher education in Ethiopia, higher education and technical training. So reading my chapter, you have to go through first a kind of an overview of aid relationships between China and Ethiopia, then something broader on educational assistance, and then I have also case studies on specific educational projects in Ethiopia, technical and vocational training. So I also found it very nice opportunity to actually be able to interview Ethiopians and Chinese in Ethiopia on how they view these assistance. And I think a surprising finding for me is that there are thousands of Ethiopians who've been going to China for training, both PhDs and masters, but most of all short-term training from 2 weeks to 6 months, something like that. And while there is a big discussion about how useful this training is, the main conclusion of those who've been there is that they have changed their image of China. They have got a much more positive image of China. So in my kind of conclusion about all this is that China has been really successful in using educational assistance as soft power. So their aim, that is written in their documents, is that educational assistance is a main tool for friendship and cooperation. And I think they have really succeeded in that. But if I'm going to talk about Ethiopia more broadly, you may have heard that Ethiopia has been a large recipient of Chinese aid. As Elling said, it's really hard to know the real numbers. And as I also experienced when I was in Ethiopia, trying to contact Chinese embassy staff and trying to get data, you don't get it. But there are, of course, databases, and you can combine things. And Ethiopia has been a top recipient, although I'm not 100% sure if it's the top, but one of the top recipients of aid globally and in Africa, especially through what is called concessional loans. That means that they use aid money in order to make the conditions for the loans better for the recipient. And what is also sure is that the way China is sponsoring or using aid money in China, now in Ethiopia, is very visible. If you go to Addis Ababa today, you see landmarks after landmarks that's paid by Chinese aid money. So this is something that is, of course, creating a strong image among Ethiopians that China is doing something. They are building parks, they are building bybane, a light railway in Addis Ababa. They are building railways from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, and so on. And they are sponsoring or building the African Union headquarters. So this is something that makes China appear as somebody who's doing something. While traditional donors, they do more invisible things. They sponsor large sector programs in education. They sponsor development of ICT systems and so on, which of course is really useful and very much valued by those who are working within the educational system. But it's not that visible. So that's also interesting.
Good. So hard to get clear, specific official data, but good to know. And reading your chapter, you will find that you did collect and find a lot of very valid data. Stein, what did you do?
Well, my chapter here is about Chinese aid to Tanzania. It's written jointly with Muhyiddin Shangwe from the University of Dar es Salaam, who is, in a sense, a product of the China relation, since he took his PhD with a fellowship from China, in China. So Tanzania is one of China's historically most important partners in Africa. Their relations started in the 1960s after Tanzania's independence, and during the time of Mao and Nyerere, Tanzania was perhaps the main Chinese partner in Africa. And the partnership was based on principles of solidarity and anti-imperialism. And the landmark project during that period was the railway built from Zambia to Dar es Salaam, the so-called Freedom Railway, or Tazara as it's called. Since then, the relationship has evolved in a different direction. It was reduced quite significantly for a couple of decades after Mao's death, when China became first more inward-looking. But then, when China started its export-oriented and more external orientation, they came back to Tanzania, but now based more on an economic basis than on the South-South solidarity or anti-imperialism that characterized the first period. So what they've done mainly in the later period is, as in line with what Elling just said, they've focused a lot on large-scale infrastructure projects, but this was also continuously combined with more traditional forms of aid. And as in the other countries, the provision of new concessional loans of large infrastructure declined, and in fact Tanzania has not taken any new such loans since 2015. The loans provided by China have concessional interest rates, so they are better loans from the Tanzanian government perspective than the loans given by the IMF or the World Bank. And they also have less conditions attached to them regarding domestic policies. But despite these re-emergence of Chinese aid to Tanzania, Tanzania does not depend on China to a very significant extent. In fact, it gets more aid and has more loans to Western donors and private banks in the West than it does to China. So there's no... some critics have accused China of what they call debt trap diplomacy, of trapping African countries with debt, which they then use to gain political influence. But that cannot be seen in the Tanzanian case, since of Tanzania's total debt burden, only a minority of it is to China. In the chapter, we also briefly describe two examples of Chinese aid-funded project. One is a large-scale infrastructure project of a gas pipeline from the south to Dar es Salaam. And the other is a health project and the construction of a big new national hospital. You asked if there was anything that was surprising to me in what I found compared to what I thought at the outset. I guess to the extent that anything was surprising, it is the same point that Lovise highlighted in the case of Ethiopia, and that is how positive the perception of China is among Tanzanians. This was seen in the interviews we did in Dar es Salaam, but also in large-scale surveys like Afrobarometers and World Value Surveys and other academic studies which have done surveys on Tanzanians' perception of China. So there's no fear of China. It's rather that Tanzanians see China as often as a better partner than what they have experienced from Western countries, both because they give concessions on the loans they give and because they don't set the type of political conditions that many interpret as a form of interference in domestic politics. I'll stop there.
All right, good. You've already touched upon a couple of points, at least, that I want to go back to. But before we start the conversation, just a couple of words about also my own chapter in the book, which is about China's distribution or engagement in aid through the multilateral channels and the multilateral international governance system. So starting it from back in the 1970s was when the People's Republic of China entered into representing China within the UN, expanding its membership in quite a lot of organizations over the last couple of decades and becoming more of a basic and regular participatory. And in the last 15 years or so, becoming much more of an active and strategically, expanding actor, positioning itself within organization with more staff and leadership position, gaining a bigger clout in voting in organizations where that matters, as Elling mentioned, alongside with its growing economic clout, also becoming the second largest contributor to the UN regular budget, and also in the last 10-15 years also parallel to that development within a traditional system, also establishing quite a few new and supplementing international organizations, especially on the development finance side, but also related to the Belt and Road Initiative and other types of Chinese initiatives. And I guess it's not really a surprise, but for me it's an interesting and very fascinating story, which still is evolving, and as Elling already pointed to, a very active, would say proactive engagement as a development system actor and a multilateral actor, but a very limited type of engagement when it comes to actively gearing up its funding system and the real kind of money in what we define as traditional aid in the way that we recognize it within the OECD system, which is also, I think, interesting to study in the years to come, where China will become a high-income country and it will have to work harder to maintain its identity as a traditional or as a remaining developing, identifying country with its economic clout and major power, superpower status. So having said that, and thank you all for your snapshot introductions. It's always the case when you ask a researcher to talk and you give them a couple of minutes, they want at least twice as much as that. But now we go into a conversation. So Elling, turning back to you, I mean, it might be obvious for all of us sitting here. I suppose that's why people turn up and why they listen in digitally. But still, I want to ask, why should we care about aid? Why do you think China cares about aid? Why should we care about what China does when it comes to international development aid? Why does it matter?
Back in the early 60s, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution appealing to all members to allocate a share of their wealth towards poor countries. And the aim was 0.7% of their gross national income should go towards development in poor countries, which was the birth of development aid as we see it today. Development aid is important for the very poor countries, the so-called least developed, some lower middle income countries, particularly those that don't have much revenues and income from trades, failing to mobilize foreign direct investment, and struggles to access commercial finance institutions. In those countries, aid is often quite important. The total volume of aid from the traditional aid donors in 2024 was about 215 billion US dollars. That was from the members of the OECD. And then there are a number of other donors that's not membered but reports to the OECD, like Turkey, Gulf states, and so on, but also quite a few others, which adds another 20 billion US dollars to that. And then you have big players like China that doesn't really report or provide details of what they provide, but estimated figures for of China is might be 5-6 billion US dollars. So it's a small thing compared to the total volume of aid provided. That aid is important for poor countries, but of course we know that aid is used for a lot of different purposes, often very tied to foreign policy priorities and so on. But yes, aid is important. Aid is important for especially the poor, the landlocked African countries, and here China is an important player. What distinguishes China from a number of the other donors, although they're becoming more similar, are perhaps I will highlight two things. One is that Chinese aid is very much tied to Chinese goods and services. There is very little cash and cash transfer involved in Chinese aid to African countries, but it's increasing. But it's primarily delivery of Chinese goods and services, and the loans are tied to the use of services and goods from Chinese companies. So that's one thing. The second thing is that is the focus, the emphasis on Chinese aid. When you look at the big picture, the big money, it's very much focused on supporting infrastructure development and to link that to stimulate and provide business development, private sector development, to a much greater extent than what traditional donors have been doing. But in both fronts, things are changing. In the traditional aid, you could simplify it saying China did what Norway did 30, 40 years ago, when we invited, people to come to Norway for shorter and longer stays. We used Norwegian companies and engineers to come and design projects and deliver it, turnkey projects. That changed because that wasn't a very efficient way of doing things. And I think China is going through a little bit of the same thing. And then the second thing is that there is now a renewed emphasis among traditional donors that in order to really facilitate development in poor countries, we need to mobilize additional resources beyond aid, private sector, commercial finance, and so on. So that's from the Western side, a new dimension.
I just want to mention that we do have also a chapter in the book that goes more into details or specific connections between the A dimensions of Chinese politics and how it's connected to foreign policy and broader development, Chinese political goals. Stein?
Yeah, just following up on the question of why is aid important and linking it to the more current geopolitical situation. With increased global rivalries, aid, to a greater extent than it has been earlier, becomes a tool of foreign policy and of geopolitical competition. And the Chinese aid to Africa must be seen in this light. And that has two important implications, I think. The first is that seen from the African government's perspective, this increased interest in Africa as a part of the greater rivalry between great powers can give African countries a new kind of autonomy or freedom that they haven't had in the period of, say, Western dominance. Because now they don't have to accept whatever they get from the Western donors. They can instead say, well, if you set those conditions, we rather go to China if they give lower interest rates or don't ask about corruption or democracy or human rights. So from the ruling regime's perspective, this gives them new opportunities and a new freedom of action, so to speak. And it's not just China and the West, it's also other new donors that come in and represent alternative partners for African governments, such as, well, India or Turkey or the Arab Emirates and others. Now, the second point is that this can be described as a kind of, from the great powers' perspective, a new scramble for Africa in the context of competition to get access to vital minerals and so on. Now, whether this new scramble represents an opportunity or a problem for the African countries will depend on the nature of the African political regimes themselves and their ability and willingness to use the opportunities that this new situation gives them in ways that actually promote development for the major proportions of their population. So my prediction would be that the ability to take advantage of it will vary a lot between the different countries, depending on the nature of, say, state capacity and the nature of political interests that dominate in each country.
All right, so you brought up greater diversity, country, major power competition. I think you mentioned major power rivalry. And turning to China, Xuefei, I don't think we necessarily talk about the domestic Chinese rivalry between the provinces, but you write about the provinces as international or actors in China's foreign and development policy. So my question is, seen from a provincial political level in China, what's like the attraction, the incentive to actually get engaged as a development aid actor?
So, first of all, China has more than 30 provincial units, and they all have, because of their geography, they all have their different endowments and resources. For border provinces in China, there has been a long tradition to interact with neighboring countries and also providing aid. And for some more advanced coastal provinces in China, in Eastern China, so there has also been a tradition for them to be the front line of Chinese economy to engage with globally, but so then it remains it leaves a majority of like landlocked Chinese provinces. I just mentioned that one province, Hunan, so because it has quite endowments for agriculture and manufacturing, so it has become a leading province in China-Africa relations in terms of in the agriculture and the manufacturing sector. And then the other case I use is the provincial unit is called Ningxia. So it's a Muslim region in China. So it takes the advantages of its Muslim link with especially Northern African countries. So this province, yes, there are like competitions in terms of like a limited state budget for the for conducting and like aid projects, but they are also like improvising and also like it's a competition and a cooperation. They're also using their different advantages and the resources. So this is how things are going with the Chinese provinces.
Mm. And as a China scholar myself, I think, and if there are China researchers out there listening in, I think, and students wanting to write about China, there's lots of ground, I think, still to cover, also comparing provincial and other, regional political dimensions in China, also when it comes to its international and development-related engagements. But Lovise, you mentioned that that Ethiopia, of course, seen from and in relation to China, is one of its main economic, political partners. It's probably, although we don't know the exact figures, but those are not transparent, probably one of the main recipients also of aid-related assistance. And you already mentioned that, the Ethiopian people that you interviewed had a quite positive perception of China, but were you able to kind of dig into or question to what extent aid in that relation is important, and the aid aspects actually something that China can play on in terms of also developing its soft power or its instruments for also communicating Chinese culture or Chinese greatness or so ever.
Yeah, that's a challenge with the combination of lack of transparency on aid figures, and also the kind of the mingling of different interests into one. So you have the private enterprises, and you have the aid, and you have the big loans. They're all linked to each other. So I think for a common Ethiopian, it's very hard to know what's what. And I think China could have done much more in order to talk about their aid and their grants that are given. But they don't, and they don't release figures. So if I was a spin doctor for China, I would certainly say that, well, there are a lot of things you should be proud of here that you can talk more about, what you've been given. But one interesting thing, nuancing the kind of positive image is also, I wanted to raise, when I interviewed Ethiopians who've been to China to study, they say, well, China was not my first choice. I went there for pragmatic reasons. The scholarships are good, and the exams for entry are not that hard. Many of them have the perception that those who go to scholarships with scholarships to China have utilized their political connections to get it. So, and then they would also say that people who come back to Ethiopia with degrees from China would also be faced with a sort of a pro-Western bias, that if you came with a PhD from Europe, it will be much easier for you to get good jobs than, say, a master's degree from China. So there is of course this kind of tension still between these two soft power powers, soft powers, you can say, between the West and China, and that even though many of them say that they are much more positive to China as a development model, they also question the content and the quality of both short-term training and longer studies, and the usefulness of it. And also the problem is that, for example, when I studied the China-built and China-initiated training of vocational and technical training college that was built by the Chinese, there are no assessments of impacts, and it's very hard to know what did this bring, and yeah, that's probably also a challenge with many other aid projects that's funded by China, that they may do their own monitoring evaluation, but it's not accessible to researchers.
We'll have to open up for questions very soon, but I wanted to ask all of you, because that also goes into your chapter, Lovise, and what Stein and others also have written about, that in some ways, not like comparing necessarily China to the aid of any other specific type of other country, but as Chinese aid profiles and programs are evolving, in some ways they also start looking a bit more the types of aid-related support that we have been used to also from European countries or other countries. So I wanted to, like before we open up, to point to a few of the challenges that you've also seen rising around the projects and the programs that you have studied in relation to aid or development assistance coming from China in the countries that you have been studying.
Well, I could start with some
Definitely,
general remarks. I think one risk associated with the cooperation with China is that it can reinforce autocratic tendencies in recipient countries. Because they don't set any conditions on human rights or democracy and that sort of thing. And if the ruling regimes get access to resources from China, they have less need to or interest in being responsive to, say, democratic demands. And in Tanzania, of course, is a case where there has been a clear trend in that kind of autocratic development over the last decade at least. And that can, of course, not be explained exclusively by the role of China. It has to do a lot with domestic politics as well. But the availability of funding from elsewhere is something that makes it possible for the regime to be less democratically responsive and accountable.
Yeah, Luisa?
Yeah, so I agree very much with your analysis, and I think with the case of Ethiopia, this has been quite visible, particularly during the war in the north of the country between 2020 and 22, between the federal government and the Tigray, the former elite of TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front. The fact that Ethiopia is able to maneuver with many different, not necessarily restricted to aid, but political actors and trade actors that are supporting and not criticizing the Ethiopian government for massive violations of international humanitarian law and attacks on civilians. It has made them able to carry out atrocities. Of course, it's not to be blaming China and others on this, but they have a policy of non-intervention, and yeah, I mean, this is very, very clear in the case of Ethiopia. It's been not only supporting an authoritarian actor, but actually making Ethiopia able to get legitimate or think that they are legitimate when in their waging the war against the northern population of Tigray. So it's giving them autonomy and larger ability to act, but also to act very, very destructively, I think.
All right, before opening up for more points on this note, I wanted to see if there were any questions from the audience here. Yes, and I think you will be given a speaker. Yeah, that you will, yeah, that you can pass around if there are more questions.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you just have to speak into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I can speak loud.
Okay.
I just have only two questions to the first presenter and to Aalen and Stein. The first one is what do you think the politics behind this aid? Because you've said that there is lack of transparency in their data. So is there anything that is linked to the politics behind that, or is China cooking perhaps something behind this? Why is this data not transparent? The second one to both of you, when you present, you're surprised that there is a positive perception of Ethiopians and Tanzanians towards China. Why is this surprising? Did you expect like a negative perception? If someone asked me, for example, this kind of questionnaire, it depends on what kind of aid to which. For example, if it is infrastructure in terms of roads, I might have a negative perception because you see that in the next couple of days, the road is gone. So it's not the quality-based kind of road. But in terms of scholarship or other things, I might have also a positive perception. But the last one for Aalen is about, for Lovise, is about, you said the students use their political kind of affiliation or something to get the scholarship. I'm not clear about that, how they use that to get either the scholarship or I don't know. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, before I give the word to respond, I just wanted to see if there were more questions in the audience here. Because then we take them all, I think,
Yeah.
assembly. Yeah.
Hello.
Those are very good questions, but they're also, yeah.
You were referring to China and collaborating with rather more authoritarian regimes. Have you discovered any pattern in China's relationship with countries in Africa, whether they deliberately and visibly have favored less democratic countries? But, well, a lot of African countries are not very democratic anyway. So, but is there a pattern there that you have discovered?
Okay, so I think because these are all very excellent and quite deep questions, some of them. So I think we'll take them combined, and then I'll give the word to each one of you. So there was one about why isn't the data more transparent on when it comes to Chinese aid? Why should anyone be surprised why African citizens have a positive view of China and Chinese aid? And then there was a question on scholarship, which was for Lovise specifically. And then the last one, if there's like a systematic pattern between China being an authoritarian country and the types of countries it develops closer relationships with, in this case, in Africa. So who wants to start?
Yeah, so maybe transparency. Are you are
I can
positioned to
I can start. You probably need to be into China studies to really understand why there's so little transparency in accessing details about public expenditure. from China. But they do have an aid budget, and we know the amount, and they do publish every third year or so a profile of that, where it goes to, but not with a breakdown to individual countries. When it comes to multilateral aid, interestingly, China doesn't really reveal everything they do, but all the recipients do. I mean, all the UN agency and the banks, they are very transparent in their sort of listing of incomes and donor support. So you get that type of data there. But increasingly we are able to get a rough picture of what they fund and what the recipients are and so on, also in individual countries. But a lot of things we don't know. For example, when it comes to the use of this concessional funding, where the aid budget is used to subsidize the interest rates, a significant portion of the loans are subsidized, but we don't know why some loans are subsidized and others are not, and what kind of decisions behind that. That's a black box, which we do not know. I remember I asked a very sort of senior Chinese academic visiting CMI in 2006. She's very close to the aid establishment and now. And at the time, we asked her, why don't you reveal the data? And she said, this is diplomacy. We don't want individual countries to know that perhaps another country is getting more than us. So that's why
what I heard, yeah.
That's why we keep it a secret. But that is also something that needs to be addressed from the Chinese side, because as a partner and the recipient of Chinese aid, you really need to know what China is providing. So that is that's my answer to that. Then the questions about China. Sort of to what extent they are singling out authoritarian versus more democratically inclined governments. If you look at where the big flows are going to, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. The biggest trade investment destination in Africa is South Africa, followed by Angola and Zambia. So it's where they can make business and when there are business opportunities. The distinctive feature is that China does not really want to interfere in domestic politics, and that's an asset too. And that can be used, as you pointed out, very cleverly by all sorts of regimes in Africa. It's very visible now in Angola and DRC. China was the key funder and provider of infrastructure development in Angola, making better access to the mines of in DRC, where China is heavily involved. But to make those railways work properly, including the harbors and so on, Angola turns to the US, even under Trump, and to Europe. And they are coming on with now much additional funding. So that's a good example of how both DRC and Angola plays on all actors, because there is now a kind of a scramble for access to the mineral fields of DRC and the rare minerals that they can supply to the modern economy. So, but my final point is, China is, and we shouldn't be surprised, they're not in the business of supporting individual human rights and democratization in Africa. And that means that when traditional donors like the US are pulling back from reducing their aid to UN institutions and others at the multilateral arena, supporting those type of things, China will not step in. And perhaps, as in the case of peacekeeping, the China pays for 15-20% of the UN's peacekeeping budget. They also send quite a number of peacekeepers to peacekeeping operations, like in South Sudan, where they are important. But China also abstains from when the Security Council adopts the mandate, because they think they go too far into politics and human rights.
I'll stop you there. There's lots more to discuss. Luckily, we'll return to other discussions and bring up also the peace and security dimension, which is very important. But we have touched upon at least two of the questions. We have two left.
Yeah.
So for the last couple of minutes, then Lovise maybe
of course,
might help us to.
But I'm also tempted to talk a bit about the question you raised. I mean, who are the strongest partners of China, democratic or autocratic? I mean, if you look beyond Africa, and if you look at the kind of partnership that China has, they have these different names and different levels of partnerships, indicating how close they are to the different countries. So Russia is the most elevated partnership. It's the strongest and closest. I can't remember the name of that partnership category. But beyond that, you have...
Without limitations.
Yes, all-weather strategic cooperation partnerships. And the countries included in the all-weather ones is Ethiopia from 2023, interestingly, Pakistan, Venezuela, Belarus, Hungary, and Cambodia. So, yeah, these you can understand what kind of countries they are. And this is related to the Belt and Road Initiative, which I am not an expert on.
No, that was my next question.
Yes,
but we're running out of time, Lovise. But could you, and Stein maybe, and Xuefei wants to point out the question of why anyone should be surprised that they are have positive views or positive attitudes. And then there was a question on the scholarship.
Yeah. So the positive, I guess, it's you're somehow pointing at maybe us as researchers also what kind of prejudices we may have
and
from the
that's a very
start.
good way of raising a question.
Yes. But I also think that there is, in my understanding when I talk to Ethiopians, is that they have this very strong duality between being being quite underwhelmed about what kind of capacity and competence they get out of the training that they get from China, which is it's not highly regarded at all. While, on the other hand, they are really, taken aback by seeing the Chinese development across when they were visiting China. So it's this duality, which is maybe, I don't know, a little bit surprising. But I think you're also right in saying that maybe we've been thinking about the Chinese quality as thinking about the Chinese goods, and then it's a kind of have an impact on the way we look at all kinds of Chinese things.
All right, we are running out of time, so I think we'll end it at that, and then I'll say thank you for everyone turning up here and listening in digitally and following up when we also circulate the recording online. So keep coming back to events at Bergen Global. I think we can also marketize that we will return to a follow-up discussion related also to marking the event of launching the book in Oslo, currently timed for 9th of April, which we expect to also be very much streamed and available online, and I'm sure we can circulate it through available challenge. So of course we encourage all the libraries and all the bookstores and all the students and all the courses and all the teachers and all the professors, both around Bergen and around the world, to adopt the book into their curriculum. Go back and read the chapters, and please return to us for questions and discussions if you're interested. But that's what we had time for today, so see you next time.